Smells so good. This is not an admission of guilt at all, but today I'm going to talk about drugs. All the drugs. Holy cow. Well, hello there. Welcome to Regular Veteran. My name's Scott, and I'm just going to get right to it. Today I'm going to be talking about drugs and the military. First, I'm going to talk about movies. The movies that have the military doing something related to drugs, running drugs, capturing people that are doing drugs, you know, all the in between. Then I'm going to talk about what drugs are, what different categories there are for drugs, what drugs do to the person that has ingested them, and then I'm going to take you through the history of the drugs that the military has been interested in and how those two have been interwoven. Then I'm gonna talk about my own experience in the military and what it was like to do drugs and not get caught. Yeah, I know this whole video is just an hour-long confession. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a confession. And then I'm gonna talk about urinalysis. If you're wondering what's gonna happen next because you just popped hot or you just took a piss test and you haven't gotten the results back yet, but it's probably gonna come back hot, you wanna wait until the end of this, I promise. I'm gonna try and connect as many of the dots as I can, but really the dots that I'm gonna try and connect are pretty much just impossible because the documents don't exist and the people that conduct whatever dot we're talking about refuse to talk about it and have already died. So a lot of this is just never gonna be known. But what we do know, I'm trying to like connect all the hierarchy so you can understand that chain of command. But really, the chain of command was never meant to be known. So that's the difficult part, is there's not a single piece of paper that shows like MK Ultra from the CIA to the DOD made project blah blah blah, and that project had this many projects and these are all the names of that. Those don't exist. I'm not giving you any new information, I'm just connecting a bunch of information that's already out there. Just trying to give it to you a little bit easier. Also, this whole episode is more of a film experiment. If you can't watch it all at one time, that's fine. Come back to it a few times in a row or make time for it later, no big deal. But I promise you, it's gonna be more comprehensive than any other drug or military channel on YouTube. Also, I'm not just talking about drugs in the Army and the Air Force and the Marines. I'm also talking about drugs in the CIA and how that relationship is very complicated. In this episode, the CIA has to be talked about because they're such an integral part of the dark operations of the military. We're also going to talk about weapons. Mustard gas, sarin gas, anthrax, cholera, the plague, typhus, TB. If you're thinking, why are we talking about nerve gas as a drug? Nobody's gonna smoke nerve gas. Nobody's gonna shoot up nerve gas. But do you even know where they test chemical weapons in our country? It's an ongoing project. It would almost always have to be going on because just like there's always going to be a military, there's always going to be research as far as different chemicals and their interactions with human beings because the military needs to know what can be used against them. Did you know that 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, Utah is a place called This is an official government video.
Dugway Proving Ground is our nation's premier testing ground for chemical, biological, radiological, and explosives hazards.
You remember when anthrax got shipped all over the country? Yeah, that was Dugway Proving Grounds. They accidentally shipped active anthrax to Texas, Maryland, Wisconsin, Delaware, New Jersey, Tennessee, New York, California, and Virginia. Probably even more. Those are just the ones that they released. So that place that looks super cool with all the bombs and shit is actually mailing people anthrax. They're a premier testing facility and they can't do their fucking job right. That's not good. Dugway Proving Ground is the size of Rhode Island, and it's owned by the federal government so that they can test whatever lethal bullshit they can come up with. It's the place that we know that exists that they do all the craziest shit that we know of. Area 52. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get going. Now is where I talk about movies. They're like a drug for your mind. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll have been the staple of every all-American badass over the past half century. I'd like to add combat to that. I think there's always been an element of, I will fight you and I don't give a shit, to that stereotypical badass. And well, that's where you marry the military and drugs. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, and the military. Which is why this list of movies makes so much sense, because there's pretty much a badass in every one of them. There's some drugs in every one of them. And I mean, the rock and roll and the sex, those are just side elements, because really today, this episode is all about drugs and the military. Pretty much every character in Guardians of the Galaxy was the result of some government program, like Jason Bourne, but more X-Men. I mean, Logan is pretty much created at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, and Stryker is running Project MK Delta. So they're just taking real stories and transferring them into fiction. I wanted to talk about movies because I think even the biggest fictional movie actually has a tidbit of truth in it. And it's just a matter of knowing what to look for and then also just looking it up later. I mean, I've learned so much just from taking out little bits of information and wondering, is that a real thing or is that some fake nonsense that they made up for just for the story? And I'm not opposed to fake nonsense, but I just want to know, you know, if we're talking about like American Made, for instance, that one's where Tom Cruise is showing the Mina connection in Arkansas.
Miss Sabota, I have Governor Clinton on the line. He says it's urgent.
The Doug Liman-helmed film's original title, Mina, was also changed to American Made in an effort to downplay the Arkansas connections. Mina references the name of the town in Arkansas that contained a clandestine airfield used to smuggle guns and drugs back and forth to Latin America during Clinton's watch as governor. Another scene cut from the film would also have implicated Bush, who was then Ronald Reagan's vice president, in the illegal scheme that sent arms to the Contras and even trained them on US soil in Mina.
Real small detail. If you don't hear it in that conversation, you'd never know. But if you look into it, interesting, huh? If you haven't seen Men Who Stare at Goats, you've got to check that one out. It's literally an LSD study by the military in a deployed location. American Gangster.
My investigation indicates that Frank Lucas is above the mafia in the dope business. My investigations also indicate that Frank Lucas buys direct from a source in Southeast Asia. He cuts out the middleman, and he uses US military planes and personnel to transport pure number 4 heroin into the United States, and he's been doing so on a regular basis since 1969.
Did he move them in dead bodies? We don't know. But did he do that in general? Yeah, definitely. Look him up. He's a really interesting guy. Denzel Washington played him so well. It's insane. But movies just, they're perfect for telling a little bit of truth and a lot of bit of whatever else makes it entertaining. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that Wormwood and Stranger Things are two of my favorite that meld these two subjects. But Combat Obscura is one of the most realistic depictions of America's occupation in the Middle East. And I think that that's really important because they smoke cannabis in the movie. And if you just switch the cannabis for a psychedelic and make it a fiction, you get Jacob's Ladder. And man, those are two movies that are really hard to follow, but also do a really good job at depicting the obscurity of war. Just as the geography of war changes, the geography of drugs has changed. Now cannabis is legal some places. Because of that change, movies like American Drug War, Traffic, Cartel, Cocaine Cowboys, And one of the best war on drugs movie, Sicario. Sicario was one of the best, oh my gosh. That movie is phenomenal. If you haven't seen Sicario, absolutely do that. It's about the war on drugs and it takes you to Mexico. Most of the movies recently that have come out about war and drugs have gone south of our borders rather than over an ocean. So that's an important change to note. And I've got to tell you my favorites that deal with all of this. And really they're my favorites because they're not just all about drugs and war, but they kind of are and they kind of aren't. And I just think they do such a great job at melding the two. And that's Pineapple Express.
What was the question again, sir?
When you think of your superiors, what emotions do you feel?
You know what problem I have with your fucking little dog and pony act you call the military? Here it is. 1, lots of dudes. Where are the boobies? 2, why are we underground right now, sir? Why can't we be out in the open? Why aren't we in a square right now? Why aren't we talking to people, letting them know item 9 exists? Get it out, shout at the rooftops. This is great. This is the bee's knees, item 9.
And American Ultra. And they're just stoner flicks. They're just action movies with a little bit of weed. And for that, I say roll one up, sit back, relax, and see what you can learn that's not factual, but that you can then look up and find the facts about. So you know some of the movies that I'm watching, some of the movies that I'm gonna use as references in this episode, but do you understand drugs? Because if you don't understand what drugs are and what I'm talking about, then this whole episode is really just useless. So you have to understand drugs, uppers, downers, stimulants, depressants, cannabis, LSD, all the things before we can really get into this. So I'm gonna teach you what drugs are and what they look like and how they smell, and no, not all that. But I am going to at least categorize them so that you understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about different things, you know? Now is where I talk about drugs. All drugs do different things, and some speed you up, some slow you down. So it's just a matter of knowing what drug you're consuming and for what purpose. So if you're just doing drugs because you want to do drugs, do drugs. But also, drugs serve a greater purpose and could be used to your benefit if you use them in the right way. For at least 4 years, I lived almost a completely double life where I would do some sort of drug experiment in my after work life, and then I would go to work and be a star performer. Drugs are just tools for control on the biggest levels, and they're a tool for self-improvement on an individual level. Just like with a hammer, you can build a house or you can break it. There's going to be negative side effects to everything we don't do in moderation. But my philosophy is you should be able to find out for yourself. You shouldn't be dependent on your government to give you that piece of information. If you want to know what smoking a joint feels like, tastes like, if you want to know what shrooms or LSD look like, smell like, you should be able to take that internal journey. If you want to know what taking a shot tastes like, makes you feel like, you should be able to. But also, you should do it safely. You should do it intelligently. We should have the ability. It should be common knowledge, because if it's common knowledge, it's not something that's hidden and scary. Some drugs are legal, some aren't. All the pills you take are distilled from a plant. Where do you think they get all the chemicals to make Advil or Tylenol or Oxy, whatever? They're taking a plant and dehydrating it and creating a powder from it and then putting it all back together in a new form. But it starts as a plant, you know? So what if we just went to that plant form? Just an idea. You don't have to agree with the government, and that's really what I'm asking you to take a look at. Do you agree with all the laws that you live under? Pretty much all art ever is made on a drug. If you're sober, congratulations. Sober people aren't bad people, they're just not as good people. Seriously, my best friend and my fiance, totally sober. Minus, you know, caffeine and sugar and, you know, those other drugs, but for the most part, the conscious changing ones, sober. If you like to do a drug, I hope it's not a detriment to yourself. Uppers are stimulants, downers are depressants. Kind of makes sense, obviously, here. The weapons are a whole different category. I'm gonna save them for last. Painkillers or narcotics, psychedelics, hallucinogens. Those are the ones that make you see funny things. You know, like, ooh, ooh. Sorry. Depressants, the downers, I honestly don't have very much experience with the downers. They make you want to go to sleep. They put you in a zone to forget everything for however long you're on them. I've had friends tell me they're the time hop drug. It's just to make you be in your own world altogether. Klonopin, Valium, Xanax, Restoril, Rufinil, Roofies. Yes, roofies, the ones that make you pass out and just like lose all self-awareness. The date rape drug, GHB, Lunesta, Sonata, Fiorina, I don't even know what that is. Ambien, I've done that one. Alcohol, I did that one when I was in. Quaaludes, which I've never done, but from The Wolf of Wall Street, they look pretty interesting. Barbiturates and benzodiazepines. Wow, I got that word right. Those are all depressants. And the whole list of narcotics is also on the depressant list, but they're also a category of their own because it's such an expansive category. And narcotics are painkillers, and most of them, if not all of them, are either an opioid made from opium or replicating that effect. So heroin, morphine, methadone, Percocet, Oxy, anything, tramadol, codeine, hydro, whatever, they all have opium or mimic its effects. Hallucinogens or psychedelics are the ones that really make you trip out and make the world go crazy, and then you feel like you have some spiritual awakening and you can see other beings. All of that's psychedelics. Psychedelics are, generally speaking, non-addictive, which is an important thing to note. Psilocybin, mescaline, lysergic acid, dithylamide, ketamine, DMT, ayahuasca. There's actually a theory that early Homo sapiens, or the predecessor to such, actually ingested psychedelics, and that developed the brain in a way that they had never known, and therefore gave them self-awareness. I don't know if I probably shouldn't put that. I think that's a little crazy. The uppers are generally thought to be like the smart drugs: Adderall, Ritalin, cocaine, amphetamines, caffeine, MDMA, Vyvanse, nicotine, Concerta, Ritalin, speed, meth, and ephedrine. Those are all stimulants, so they make your heart faster. Stimulants have been one of the most used in war. They make people feel invincible, so you do a stimulant, whether you smoke it or you drink it or you ingest it somehow, and then you go off into battle. Sometimes you'll re-up while you're in battle, but it makes you move faster, makes you feel like, you know, maybe a warrior? I don't know. We use caffeine to get started, to focus, to, you know, get our bodies moving, whatever. What if caffeine wasn't a thing for us, and then you drink a whole cup of coffee? You'd be out of your mind. It would feel like a drug. The fact that if you do prescription drugs that are prescribed to you outside of your prescribed date, you will lose your career is absolutely absurd. Like, fuck off. What if that same ailment just exists longer? What if it's a chronic ailment? So fucking dumb. I cannot stand the way that the military handles drugs in general. It's ridiculous. The weapons aspect of this is just crazy. I'm just gonna read them, so excuse me for not looking you in the face, but it's just easier, and I've been drinking, bitch. Blood agents, blistering agents, vomiting agents, mycotic agents, choking agents, tear agents, psycho agents, bacterial agents, nerve agents, experimental agents, chlamydial agents, rickettsial, viral, mosquitoes, biological toxins, simulants, simulants, not stimulants, but simulants, ones, drugs or weapons that simulate other weapons. Fleas, and the best of them, radiological, so nuclear, whatever. And pretty much all of those are or can be lethal and or incapacitating. Cannabis is my favorite drug. Well, or caffeine. I really like sugar too. Sugar's not even on this list, but god damn if that's not the best drug. I feel like most of America is addicted to sugar. Now is where I talk about history. It's always important to look at history through all sorts of different lenses, and to do that you have to look at the individual perspective as well as the big events that are happening. Back when Europeans were colonizing America, they gave indigenous people blankets infected with smallpox, knowingly, purposefully. That's some vile shit, and that is absolutely biological warfare. It makes sense that we would be obsessed with the idea of doing more with less. The more a single human can do, the less we have to risk when going to war. I mean, that's kind of the nature of war, right? You send your most badass motherfucker, I'll send my most badass motherfucker, and at the end of the day, we'll see who rules. You can add more to the team if you want to, but that's essentially the nature of war. And if we could, we would just send in one guy and he would topple the whole government, and we wouldn't have to risk any more than necessary, and he could just assassinate the one leader or whatever and take care of things for us. That sounds perfect. And that's the nature of Jason Bourne and why a project like MK Ultra or MK Delta would exist. And I mean, why not teach our super soldiers that we've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in to become the most elite assassins ever? Why not go ahead and teach them how to astral project and see the enemy's X, Y, or Z from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away? Why not make every soldier in the military a psychic, or at least have like a psyops? Wait, there is a psyops? Well, that's why we want to make our warriors unfuckable with. We want them to be mentally and physically superior, and if we can just get rid of the emotional baggage, then absolutely, thank you. Oh my God. And what we've seen is that the CIA has really also been interested in erasing memories and their assassins not having the ability to recall whether they did or did not partake in a plot. So that is also something that apparently is desired by the CIA, and it's something that's repeated in the Bourne series. And I mean, we just know that the CIA would do some shit like that for sure. I mean, that's pretty much the whole MK Ultra all tied up in a bow. We don't just want them to get rid of their emotions and be mentally and physically superior. We also would give them the immunity of not having to suffer from any virus or bacteria ever, if possible. And really, we would inject thousands of people just to make sure that one person was able to accomplish that. And we know that because it's happened. That's what the military does. They just repeatedly try their vaccines and any of the things that they think is going to help. We all got them, you know? Something that you can absolutely see with ease in 1984 is the use of names to brainwash. And I thought he did such a beautiful job in 1984 displaying it, but it's happening in our country just the same. The Department of Defense is not a defensive agency, it's one that goes out and creates war. It's not purely defensively sitting on our nation's borders, on all the country's edges, and defending it against everyone that comes in. It's out and defending.
If every man does not come out, we're gonna go in and pull every
offensively. What does any of this even matter? if you're trying to brainwash someone, you're ultimately trying to control them, right? Between the 50s and 70s, the CIA conducted a project named MK Ultra, and that is absolutely true. All the documents that they had been collecting over the 20 years that this program was alive were actually burnt. They built a new incinerator that was larger at the CIA when Director Helms was getting ready to exit office, and that right there has to tell you something. Like, they knew that they were doing wrong. They knew that their legacy would be tarnished by the information that was on those papers, and that...
Burn it, you burn it.
It's weird to ask the organization that you know has been lying to you for the documents that they've been lying about. How do you ever know that you're getting the truth? This reporter asked the best question, and I think it's actually one that we need to ask a lot more.
Senator, the Rockefeller report didn't seem to go into any abuses that hadn't already been hinted at in the newspapers. Have you found any evidence of things that are still unknown by the general public, things that haven't been in the press?
That's it. They're hiding everything unless we find it first. If we find it, then they'll tell us about it, but if we don't find it, then they're not going to say shit about it. And if you watch Wormwood, you know that you're not even getting the truth when they tell you that they're telling you the truth. So who do you even believe? Okay, the crazy thing is MK Ultra was actually a rebranding of MK Artichoke and MK Delta being combined, but MK Artichoke was a rebranding of Project Paperclip. Brought over 1,000 Nazi scientists to help the CIA develop new weapons and more LSD. Project Paperclip is fucking crazy, but also kind of expected with any end of war, I would presume. If you bring all those scientists here and you're not putting them in jail, then what happens to them? They probably get jobs here doing what they were doing there. So they got paid to do their experiments here in the US? Probably some of them under this project, honestly. But that's not even where America's obsession with chemical weapons actually started. We started experimenting long before that. If you haven't heard of Project MK Ultra, then you've been living under a rock. But that's okay. Just understand, it wasn't something that was new to our country. Our country had already been experimenting on different populations for decades. And actually, doing research for this project and for this episode, I came to understand that the Nazis actually, the Tuskegee Syphilis Project is one of the worst things our government has ever done. And it was quoted in Nazi literature as far as experimental procedures. So the Nazis were actually adopting American philosophies in their testing on the Jews. We had already been doing that on the black population. That was us testing on our own people. The Tuskegee Syphilis Project goes back to the 1930s. All of the projects that I'm talking about in this film have really been the catalyst for informed consent, making sure that if someone's being experimented on, they understand the extent of the project, because without that, things like this could go on forever. And they probably still are going on, just in a darker, deeper context and more hidden from the public eye than ever. I honestly have a theory that a lot of the UFO sightings between the 50s and 80s were probably linked to accidental or unknown dosing of drugs by the CIA. It said that literally hundreds of thousands of people came in contact with CIA agents and narcs and spooks. They just did whatever the fuck they wanted and just wrote it down after. They used grad students, they used doctors, they used institutions, they made up phony institutions just to conduct research under the guise of helping people. What would Captain America be like if he was a psychic? What would Captain America be like if he could kill someone with his mind? What would Captain America be like if he could astral project and go stalking around Russia before he ever got there? If you're thinking, wait, how did we get from handing out smallpox infected blankets to MK Ultra? Well, we're getting there. Back in 1918, when the Department of Defense was actually called the War Department, they created a department of the Army called the Chemical Warfare Service. And that was in response to the Germans using gas on the battlefield in World War I. It was chlorine gas, one of the gases that is still used today on American troops. Not really, but there was an instance in Germany when I was there of some terrorists trying to use chlorine gas on the base that I was at. No bullshit. After the Great War ended though, our obsession turned to delivery and effectiveness. So we tried to make it more lethal, and we tried to make our delivery as quick as possible, but the stockpiling didn't really take place until World War II was already kicking off in other countries. Unfortunately, whatever the Chemical Warfare Service was learning in their experiments and their tests, it just wasn't translating to the conventional military. So no one actually knew how to respond to chemical warfare in a battle situation when we were coming up to battle situations. So something had to change, and that's when it became standard to start gassing people in basic training. Not just was it not translating though, we definitely didn't have what it took to sustain any sort of long-term chemical war. And we didn't want to be caught with our hands behind our back if that's what the war became, because at the beginning of World War II, the worst thing that could be done was chemical warfare. We didn't even know nuclear bombs were a thing yet. In 1938, Alfred Hoffman synthesized LSD. He was looking for what is that called? He was looking for a medically viable ergot alkaloid. It pretty much sat on a shelf for about 5 years, and then the CIA was founded and LSD came out that same year. He actually accidentally ingested it, and that's when he documented his experience, and we really had our first trip as a human being. Thank you, Albert. I've been calling him Alfred. Whoops. Thank you, Albert. It's so funny to think about nerdy scientists doing drugs. We always think about like bad boys doing drugs, but really like chemists are the ones that are doing the experiments and then finding it and accidentally or experimentally testing it on themselves. So it's really guys in white lab coats that we got to worry about, not these bad boys walking around in jean jackets.
As soon as the CIA was created, it seems like the first thing on their mind was LSD. Could Russia get a hold of it and subdue our troops? Could we get a hold of it and subdue Russia's troops? What is the price to pay if they aerosolize it and drop it over a big city? And all of these answers were up to the CIA to answer. Well, at least that's how they felt. So how could it empower Russia to defeat us? Project Bluebird was the exploration of mind control techniques, and Project Artichoke was the experimentation of interrogation techniques. Definitely different projects. The two projects ran concurrently, and then they combined with MK Delta to become, well, I mean, MK Delta actually continued to run, and shit, it could still be running. It probably has a different name, but we don't know. These special interrogation methods have been known to include the use of drugs and chemicals, hypnosis, and total isolation, a form of psychological harassment. MK Ultra was the R&D department to learn everything they could to use in MK Delta, and MK Naomi was actually the project to just store and deliver. Honestly, from what drugs I've done and what I've read, I really just think that sleep deprivation and water are probably the two best information gathering techniques around. Obviously, sex gets information as well, but I've also never been interrogated or interrogated anyone, so how should I even know? I really do think that being nice and just being persuasive is probably a little bit better to gather information. It's probably easier, you get better information if they trust you and want to give you that information. What's wild is MK Ultra was a headline operation for at least 149 sub-projects, at least 185 doctors, and at least 80 institutions. But that number is probably incredibly low because they found 20,000 documents, and those didn't even start to give all the details. Considering these institutions are universities and corporations, branches of the military, and hospitals, it seems very likely to me that these numbers are very low. So far, I've pretty much solely focused on Project MK Ultra and the CIA. And I know that, and it's just because it's so important that you understand how large of an operation this really was. It was nationwide, it was global really, because when it was put into action, it wasn't in our country that it was put into action. Project 112 was the DoD extension of MK Ultra, and there were sub-projects under Project 112, and it was really the funding funneled through Project 112 to all of these other projects. Project SHAD. Project SHAD is Shipboard, Hazard, and Defense. They literally loaded up a US boat full of US sailors and then bombed it with biological weapons to see what would happen. Did the defenses work or not? And they just had everybody do their jobs and react to this. What the fuck? It's connected to Project 112. Some people knew that they were being tested on, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, come on. If you look at the VA's website, it says that they had about 5,500 veterans involved in Project SHAD. I'm sure that the family involved in that would make that number much, much higher, but I mean, it gives you some semblance of a number. Operation LAC, or Large Area Coverage, was considered a success because the particles that they dumped into the air, the zinc cadmium sulfide, was found over 1,200 miles away, but it didn't go the direction that they thought it was going to. So we know that they were putting all sorts of chemicals into the air just to see what would happen. Why wouldn't they be doing that now? America was just getting its biological weapons together at the end of World War II. So they almost needed another war to go to test out all of these weapons that they had developed outside of the most powerful bomb that we'd ever seen. So the Korean War was almost solely fought to experiment with new types of biological weapons. And at the same time, their soldiers were getting addicted to drugs on an individual level. In the Korean War, they invented the speedball, which is a mixture of amphetamines and opioids. The Vietnam War invented the shotgun, that hit. If you've ever smoked weed for any extended time in your life, you know what a shotgun hit is. And it's changed a little bit over time, but the original video footage is actually right here. I've got it for you.
This is Fire Support Base Aries, 50 miles northeast of Saigon. Vito is a 20-year-old draftee from Philadelphia. A photographer before he entered the Army, Vito is now a squad leader, responsible for the lives of a dozen men.
Well, it's a 12-gauge shotgun. What we basically use it for on the LZ and I guess even out in the field, so if you want to know, is that we use the shotgun. from a ball. You know, you just put the ball in a chamber and all. Paul, let me borrow that ball from you. This is probably all SIDS and we're getting busted, but I don't care.
Shotgun.
What's happening here is also happening to some extent at virtually every other American installation in Vietnam. Recent surveys estimate that well over 50% of the soldiers in Vietnam use marijuana.
You get really stoned. Then, you know, who cares about the war?
Vietnam was interesting because it was dubbed the experimental war, and that's where apparently on flights home it was not uncommon to see people suffering from withdrawal symptoms, and that sounds absolutely terrible. The drug use in war and then coming home to no drugs and really no easy way of procuring drugs actually caused PTSD for some soldiers, which is terrible. We could, instead of just saying no, why can't we help those men and women that came back? In 1971, they did a study and found that 20% of US troops in Vietnam were addicted to heroin and 50% smoked weed habitually.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. Fundamentally, it is essential for the American people to be alerted to this danger, to recognize that it is a danger that will not pass with the passing of the war in Vietnam, which has brought to our attention the fact that a number of young Americans have become addicts as they serve abroad, whether in Vietnam or Europe or other places. Because the problem existed before we became involved in Vietnam, it will continue to exist afterwards, and that is why this offensive deals with the problem.
That meant that the US military actually became a zero-tolerance community. So if you got caught doing drugs one time, you're out of there. And that was a huge change. Previously, commanders had the ability to prescribe anything. They could give you whatever medications that you wanted, and Benzedrine was their top choice. It kept people awake for way longer than they necessarily needed to or should, and really, quite a few commanders thought that this was part of the reason that they did so well in the war. Big thanks to Seymour Hersh and the Church Committee. Without those two, our entire country might not even know about Project MKUltra yet. That would be a real injustice because we need to know, and really we need to know the vastness, but we'll never know that. It sounds suspicious to me that someone just forgot that there were thousands of papers detailing all the financial proceedings from this project in a warehouse, but I mean, cool. I'm glad that they did, whether it was on purpose or not, great. I wish they could find another warehouse full of papers detailing another part of this project. I hate the idea that politicians get to keep secrets or that high-ranking political figures have a right to hide things from the public just because they've been elected to represent the public. That's a big red flag to me. I do not think that that should be something that America stands for, just letting whoever has a security clearance just gets to know more. What? No. While the CIA was getting in trouble for MKUltra, they were still running drugs through Mena, Arkansas. And that is the irony of the whole situation, is you can slap them on the hand, but they have multiple hands, and not just two. They got a lot of hands on deck. I'm curious as to where all of these operations that I've been talking about are now. What's the evolution of these thoughts and processes look like? We have the textbook for assassination thanks to this time period. We have the textbook for brainwashing thanks to this time period. The Army and CIA had been testing chemical and biological weapons on South American countries for decades. In the 70s, the whole perspective changed. Peace and drugs were popular and war actually became the enemy. But by the 70s, the war machine had figured it out and really had started to take over, and characters in the government started to understand and manipulate information to their benefit way better in the 70s. And the information that has come out since the church committee has really been in the form of slip-ups or moving of a stockpile from one place to another. And it really just points out the fact that that wasn't happening when they said it was happening. So if that wasn't happening then, what else were they lying about then, or what are they lying about now? You see, we very clearly did whatever the fuck we wanted after saving the rest of the world from dictators in World War II. So we kept stockpiles of weapons and bunkers across the planet. It's kind of funny because there's clear instances where another country was like, hey, can you get that out of our country? And we were like, yeah, okay, no problem. And then we just did whatever we wanted, just disrespecting that country altogether. They are really going to end up doing whatever we say, unfortunately. And I think that that's a power that we've been abusing for too long. Operation Chase, or cut holes and sink them, is a real project, and that's actually what they did with mustard gas, VX gas, nerve gas on a ship and then sunk it. That's how, that was the, oh, we'll get rid of it. But what happens to those barrels when the ocean just erodes them? That's bound to happen. We're still stockpiling those weapons on Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Islands. So while America was saying no to drugs, the majority of the countries that we were still occupying were asking us to get our disasters waiting to happen out of their proximity.
The sea lift was being loaded. A pallet containing 15 rockets dropped from a height of 40 feet into the hold of the ship.
Considering we were purposefully and accidentally poisoning our own people, it's totally understandable that another country would be like, can you get that away from us? Okay, so I need to get to this interview, but I hope that you're learning something, and if anything, I'm just giving you things that you can Google. There should be just a list of all the things that you didn't know about that you can go and find out more information on. I just want to give you a short list of interesting places, people, things that I would also like to add to that list. Fort Douglas, Fort McClellan, Isla San Jose in Panama, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Edgewood Arsenal. There's also Deseret Test Center, Wright-Patterson. That's a weird base for sure. And operations you should look up: Operation Takeoff, the Amherst smallpox letters, MK Search, MK Often, and MK Chickwit. Those, I can't even really find very much about them. They're supposed to have been the rebranding of MK Ultra and MK Delta, but there's just way more on MK Ultra and MK Delta. Not even all that much on MK Delta. Operation Steel Box, Operation Red Hat, DARPA, Project Chatter. Project Stargate was going on in the 1990s. Defense Science Board. Their quantum technology push is absolutely terrifying. Like, Lacoste was in style when Project Stargate was going on, and you're telling me this is not going on anymore? Yeah, fuck off. All right, now I promise it's the interview. It's been in the works for almost a year and a half, and really it's been in the works for many decades, because it's stories from not just, you know, my experience, but also people that I know that did drugs throughout the history of the military, whether it was Vietnam or during the Cold War. These are stories that you should hear, because it's not just today that drugs were being done in war, but they are still being done today. So that's where our defense budget's going? I remember when Lacoste was in style. Important characters that you should definitely check out: Sidney Gottlieb, Lieutenant Dr. Charles Savage, Ray Treichler, Jolly West, Jimmy Shaver, James B. Stanley vs. United States. That's obviously a court case. Roger Smith, Jack Ruby, Oswald's killer. He was actually a patient of Dr. Jolly West. They were running a program out of Lackland, and he was studying how to induce insanity without the person's knowledge. When I just Googled Project Shad to look up how many people were involved, it came up at the bottom with Operation Autumn Gold, Operation Sea Spray, and Operation LAC. I already told you about LAC, but Sea Spray and Autumn Gold, check them out. All right, and as soon as they're done chatting, I'm gonna tell you about urinalysis, and then like they're trying to like bend time and space. They're trying to have like a gravity gun or a ray gun or, whoa. Yeah, you're just gonna be right on the right. Yep, perfect. Thank you so much for coming. Holy cow. You gotta tell me what you wanna know. Okay, we'll get right to it. When did you join? When did I join? Yeah. 1950, 1970, 80, 2000, so 2006. 1990, 2016. Yeah, what drugs did you do while you were in? What drugs did I do while I was in? What? Wow. Yeah, what drugs did you do? What drugs are there? No. Let's see. I did speed one time. I did ecstasy a few times. I did, what else? Cocaine one time. That shit was fake though, so fake I don't really count that. Like, like just a powder of some sort, I'm assuming. What else? I smoked weed at like quite a few times. What else is there? I didn't really do any psychedelics whenever I was in. I guess ecstasy is considered, is ecstasy considered a psychedelic? No, it's a methamphetamine or MDMA. It's not a psychedelic, it's a stimulant with psychological effects. Okay, yeah. Anyways, what is that thing that you're lighting the? This is a hemp wick. Oh, okay. You light it with this instead of straight with the lighter, and it just tastes better. That makes sense. It wasn't until after the military that I really got into some psychedelics, and that shit is crazy. Crazy, like crazy, changing your life into a more spiritual, compassionate, empathic person. Great. After I got out, I really started smoking weed like regularly. It's a great way to pass the time. It really helps my mind focus on what I'm doing. When I started smoking weed, I told myself I'm not gonna be that lazy stoner type, so instead I made it that anytime I was smoking, I had to get to work. I had to be doing something for myself and creating something. So for me, cannabis puts me to work instead of to sleep, which I think is different than a lot of people get from it. So it sounds like it. Yeah, no, that's pretty cool. I think that's something that I did for myself in aligning cannabis with work. Creative work, but work nonetheless. Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I like your approach. That's really smart. It's a really intelligent way to approach a drug. Hold on one second. So, while he's just on his phone. Wow, really? Sorry about this. Oh, no problem. I wouldn't want our interview to interrupt your texting. It's okay. One time I had to go to a commander's call, and I had just smoked the night before. I was freaking out. My buddy that I had smoked with was with me, and really, I don't even know what the fuck happened, honestly. Like, they picked every other person to go and take a piss test, and I had to. That sounds I had intense. To pee, and I just went and peed and just acted as normal as possible, and nothing ever came of it. I don't really know how that happened. Wow, okay. So, it sounds like there was some defunct urinalysis. Then another time in Hawaii, happens all the time. That was in Germany. My buddy bought the weed from a dorm. A dorm, like on base? What the fuck? A dorm on base. I didn't even, like, what? I know. Like they were just keeping it in their room? That's ridiculous. Right? What about dorm inspections? On my deployment, a friend of mine got some on your deployment? Weed edibles, and we smoked. You were doing drugs on your deployment? That somebody got from local national, but the edibles, holy shit, they were from California, and they were Fruity Pebble Rice Krispie treats, and they had weed infused in them. Wow, you were doing drugs on your deployment, and you had them mailed to you across the world. It was really my first edible, and that's insane. I didn't know how strong they were, so it tasted so good that I just kept eating it, and I can still taste it. It made me throw up later that night, and I was thinking, that night being like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because I worked from midnight to noon. And oh my gosh, I was freaking out because I had to go down into our communal bathroom, and I was upchucking, and all of my friends had ate it. We drank some whiskey. The next day was our day off. You were throwing up, and you described the story as great. Okay. Smoking downrange isn't nearly as big of a deal because they don't test for that shit. Interesting. They don't test you when you're downrange. They really just test you when you're at home. We had 6 months of just like, if you can get it, you can smoke it. It's just like a free-for-all when you get to where you're going. Interesting. Does everybody do drugs when you're deployed? Or just, how did you keep from getting caught? In Hawaii, I had a drug test come up, and a friend of mine was making calls from work, but I didn't pick up because in my phone I had work do not answer as the name for all the numbers from work. So instead, I didn't answer. My buddy texted me and he's like, hey, it's a commander's call. Everybody's gonna have to come in. I had just been out drinking and smoking. It was my birthday. I knew I was getting out, so the band at the bar was like, yo, we're gonna take a step outside and smoke. And it was like a fucking Tuesday, and it didn't matter to me. So I go outside, smoke a joint with them, just a little bit. When I was in, just one hit was like, whoa. It was probably 8 hours from the first time they called me until I responded. And in that 8 hours, I was in communication with a friend of mine that was at work telling me what was going on and how many people had responded. And your story stressed me out. I just didn't want to be the last person, so he told me when I was the second to last person. Really helpful. It also helped that I was just really good friends with all of the higher up, and they were like, hey, you gotta go talk to Captain. And I was like, all right, hey Captain, what's up? And then she's like, we're looking for people that do drugs, not looking for you. Oh, get out of here. Gosh. You're fine. You didn't even have to pee. I just told her I'd been out for my birthday the night
You didn't
before.
even have to take a piss test. The whole squadron did, and he didn't even have to take a piss test. Holy shit.
Anyways, that was probably the scariest because the LT was pounding on my door.
You never got caught?
I never got caught. Nope, not once.
Wow. Does that happen like every branch probably?
I don't know.
How many times did you do drugs maybe?
A dozen, 2 dozen experiences with drugs while I was in. Didn't get caught once.
I'm honestly just relaying the stories that everyone's told me because
he didn't do
so
drugs.
interesting.
Never.
You know?
Mr. I didn't do drugs as he's smoking drugs. Anyways, later in this episode, I'm going to tell you so many other things.
Sorry about the smoke.
Oh, don't even worry about it. I don't care at all. I actually kind of like it.
I don't want you to get in trouble, you know?
I shouldn't show up. Urinalysis is like pretty easy. They test them all as one, and then, well, I'm going to tell you all about urinalysis later in this episode, so just stick around, you know?
My name's Scott.
No.
You're watching Regular Veteran. I'll see you on the internet. Thanks
Wait, what? No, you're not. This isn't over. Stop it. Come back. You're not doing my outro. I have more questions. Come here. I think you can smoke weed and be a professional, just like you can drink alcohol and be a professional. So I got promoted faster than you're necessarily supposed to. I could excel if I wanted to, but I didn't fit in the military culture. Why not? It's too political. There's way too much bullshit. Oh. And you have way too many opportunities to work for an absolute dumbass as a boss. And I just could not have that. It would absolutely make me suicidal, and I understand why the military has such a high suicide rate, because that is not a culture of connectedness. What is it a culture of then? It's a culture of obedience, and that's not who I am. I really just smoked because I wanted to experiment. My grandma was calling me.
Oh, yeah, no, totally.
Hey grandma, what's the news? Okay.
Why did you even want to make this episode?
Anyways.
Why did you risk getting in trouble in the military for
why does a
drugs?
journalist go and find the story? Because they want to know. Because they want to share it with everyone. I didn't go to school for journalism, but these are stories I want to share. And I think they're important. And
I'm always down for a good story.
It made me feel like a badass to just do what I knew was the worst thing you could do drugs.
Do you think you're a badass now?
You know, I just wanted to be a badass.
Does it make you more badass now that it's
still
legal?
want to be a badass? I don't know. Why did I do drugs?
I mean, I enjoy it. That's why anybody does anything, really, right? Because we enjoy it?
Yeah. It's fun.
Well, I guess maybe not.
I really support the Weed for Warriors. So,
yeah, I heard you actually protested with them in DC.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
If you have any questions about drugs, drug tests while you're in the military, just, let me know. Hit me up in the comments below.
Okay.
I'll definitely answer your questions.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of fun making this video.
I'm not a professional, but I know a lot.
I'd love to, connect with some more people that were in the military, enjoy some recreational substance that's conscious changing. The history of drugs in the military is actually one of my favorite topics.
I actually just talked about that a little bit ago.
I've been researching it so much since I got out. I could pretty much make a documentary about it.
Now is where I talk about urine. These are actually a bunch of official government videos all put together in a mashup. You're welcome. I don't know why. Why not? That's the better question.
The 5 drug types the labs test for are marijuana, cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine, designer amphetamines such as ecstasy and heroin. Additionally, a random selection of batches is tested for a larger panel of drugs. Once ready for testing, the specimens are securely transferred to a screening technician. Only certified testing staff members have access to the specimen aliquots.
Immunoassay is just a bunch of fancy equipment doing science. If a sample tests presumptively positive, then it's sent for further testing. Further testing is accomplished by using a lot of CSI-type
technology.
Testing is done to ensure accuracy so the members who aren't using drugs don't get blamed for using drugs. Bottom line, if you're using drugs, you're going to get caught and you will be subject to discharge or legal action.
Urinalysis is one of the weirdest parts of the military, in my opinion. Whether you're looking at someone's junk or having someone look at your junk, it's all just because a few chemical compounds may or may not be in your urine, and most likely not.
Drug use is not a problem of critical proportions in the Air Force, but it is a problem, and that is unacceptable. So something effective is being done about it.
If you watch any of the military YouTubers, they're just gonna tell you, just say no, don't do it, it's not worth it, whatever. I'm telling you, you know what? People do drugs. Curiosity is way more powerful than your deterrent of a urinalysis. I asked my friend David over at CBS to talk to the DoD PA office, and they sent us the Navy SEALs. So this is what he had to say.
Like the rest of the military, SEALs are supposed to be subjected to random urinalysis. But in practice, they aren't tested when they are away from their home base. which is much of the time because their skills are in constant demand. 3 active duty SEALs told us they had not been tested in years. Sands vowed to change that.
We're going to test on the road. We're going to test on deployment. If you do drugs, if you decide to be that selfish individual, which I don't think anyone's going to do after today, I believe that, then you will be caught.
Commodore Jamie Sands called an all-hands meeting referencing drug problem in Group 2. Sounds like he's dealing with it.
Well, I think it has gotten to a point where he had to deal with it. I hope he's somebody that we can rally behind and hold people accountable, but I'm not sure at this point.
It's because it's hugely important.
As part of the safety stand-down, all SEALs were required to submit to urinalysis. One SEAL who had tested positive for cocaine last summer tested positive again, this time for prescription drugs. He is being kicked off the teams. Scott, after speaking by phone with one of the SEALs who attended that meeting, I asked if we could talk again, which would require using a cell phone that could not be traced. He said, sure, and then he added, we need help.
Wow, David, tell the SEALs that help is on the way. Regular veteran, right here. I've got as many resources coming as I can. Just stay tuned. With a little proper planning, urinalysis is no big deal. Trust me.
The urinalysis program is succeeding, achieving both of its defined objectives, deterrence and detection of drug use by Air Force people. When testing for the marijuana metabolite THC first began, there was a sharp rise in positive identifications of marijuana users. As people became aware of how well the testing program could identify users, the positives started to decline, indicating a substantial drop in the use of marijuana. We find the same trend in the use of other drugs. The urinalysis program correctly, accurately, and fairly identifies drug users. It uses state-of-the-art technology operated by a highly trained staff. Performance is constantly monitored through both internal and external quality controls. Chain of custody is very carefully maintained from start to finish. The accuracy of all test results and all record keeping is checked and rechecked all along the way. The result is a program that works. It enables commanders to detect fairly and with great reliability the use of drugs within their unit. And because the program effectively detects, its very existence effectively deters the individual who knows that drug use is likely to be discovered and proven.
If you're in the military and you've popped hot or tested hot on a urinalysis, it's important that the first thing you do when you're questioned or notified is you invoke your rights under Article 31 and ask to speak to a military lawyer. One of the first things that a defense attorney is going to want is something called a litigation packet. And that's a packet that comes from the drug testing lab, which will indicate the level that you've tested at. Oftentimes, nanogram levels are low enough that there are many defenses, whether it be innocent ingestion, a problem with the collection point, a problem at the drug lab. They not only have to prove that you wrongfully used, but that you knew that you wrongfully used, which is not an easy burden for the government. Oftentimes, we can be successful in putting forward a defense for a hot urinalysis. A hot urinalysis will usually result in an Article 15 or potentially preferral of court-martial charges. Before you make any statements admitting to anything or trying to talk your way out of anything, that you talk to a lawyer about a hot urinalysis.
The popularity of synthetic cannabinoids is largely driven by the fact that they didn't show up on these urine tests. So initially it was in the military, then it was people who were on parole or probation, people who were living hard lives, wanted to get high, couldn't get high. This was a way that they could do it. And so they incentivized people that just wanted to smoke weed using completely untested synthetic cannabinoids instead as a direct result of these urine tests.
Well, it's also just a complete misunderstanding when it comes to the actual effects and how long they last. You're not even testing a person's conscious state. You're testing whether or not a person has altered their state of consciousness outside of their working time. You know, it's not like you show up and they could scan your hand and realize that you're high on marijuana right now. It's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're testing you for something that could linger in your body for weeks after these psychoactive effects have long since gone.
Oh yeah, or even be the result of passive exposure. There was a great scientific article that came out a couple of years ago where they found that just passive exposure to cannabis smoke contaminates your hair with THC, so that all these people who had hair tests, who actually had not smoked cannabis, but it sounds like an excuse, I was just in the room, someone else is doing it, just being in contact with someone who'd smoked cannabis could then deposit THC in your hair and cause you to test positive. So these tests aren't even necessarily reliable.
There's so much fucked up with that system that don't go down without swinging. You know what I'm saying? Especially don't throw yourself under the bus. Don't do drugs and say that it was my idea and then get hemmed up and then you lose your career because you were a dumbass. Okay, my call to action for this video is not to go off and do drugs. It's just to question things and, you know, be a smarter human being. So many videos on YouTube about how urinalysis is done in the military. By all means, check it out. What else?
Now is where I talk about resources.
You know, those things that you should go to if you're looking for information yourself.
I've done my best to get rid of all the nonsense and just put the things that you should actually check out. If you're wondering about drugs or the military, or how the military used, confused, and abused drugs, there's a link below for you, guaranteed. If you're thinking about doing a drug, you should probably check out Psyched Substance. It's just such a mind-opening channel. I love it so much. Also check out maps.org. It's tracking the FDA approval of MDMA. There's also Breaking Open the Mind. It's a fantastic book that talks a lot about exactly what we're talking about here. Graham Hancock has so much information. If you've never heard of him, definitely check him out. I watched that documentary called Out of Shadows, where the stuntman tries to out all of Hollywood, and I thought that that was a really, really interesting take. I can't say that I 100% endorse it just because the religious undertones of the film, but otherwise I thought that the information they were trying to connect and the projects that they talked about from the federal government and the places that the generals went after they served were all very relevant and informative. I thought, you know, it goes really, really well with this episode specifically, and the next episode that I'm going to be doing an in-depth dive on about the propaganda machine of America. That's going to be a really good one, so make sure you pay attention for that. Subscribe. What else? Annie Jacobson is just a phenomenal resource for everything that I've been talking about. Definitely just, I mean, on YouTube, Annie Jacobson. I'll put a link below, but she's got multiple talks and they're absolutely mind-blowing. Tom O'Neill's Joe Rogan podcast was absolutely phenomenal. I haven't read his book yet, but I'm definitely going to. He seems like he's done all of the research you could possibly do on MK Ultra, and I mean, that's not even where his focus was. It just led him down that rabbit hole.
Oh my gosh, Arrowhead, so good.
Also, look up Hamilton Morris. Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia is an excellent resource. If you're selective about which ones you watch, Joe Rogan's podcast is a phenomenal resource. He asks great questions and he has some of the most amazing guests. Okay, I think I got through pretty much all of it.
If you've done drugs in the military, I would like to know your story. I would like to be able to just read your story out loud. So if you have one of those stories, I want to know. Direct message me on whatever social media platform you want. If it's a video and I can share it, all the better. But if you would just like to be anonymous, I won't read your name, just mention that you want to stay anonymous and I'll just tell your story. It's so weird to think that the hippies could be right. Peace and love, you know? I'm gonna try and put those time links down below in a comment. They might work, they might not, I don't know. But it'll be my first time trying to do that. But also, this episode is so fucking long, you need those, right? If you made it all the way to the end, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
I love you. Goodbye.
My name's Scott, you're watching Regular Veteran. I'll see you on the internet.